In this video, I'm going to do the first upgrade to my home network that I've done in a couple of years. And that's where I replaced my USG-Pro with a UDM-Pro, or the UniFi Security Gateway Pro with a UniFi Dream Machine Pro, because that's the names. And yeah, for the last couple of years I've been using a UniFi Security Gateway Pro as my router, and it's worked really well. I did a video previously talking about 2 years of UniFi, so if you've not seen that, go and watch it, because I've talked about the hardware, a lot of good things, but a couple of negative things I've found. But I just fancied a bit of an upgrade. The USG Pros worked absolutely fine, but I fancied a bit of a change and move to something a bit newer, so I thought I'll try this out. And it'll be good for future expansion if I ever get any 10 gig equipment or want to replace my switch in there with one that has a 10 gig uplink, which could be quite good to have. But what I also want to do is take a bit of a critical look at this, just to look at actually how it works, what it's good for, but also where it's potentially a bit worse than a USG in certain niche use cases. Because there's a lot of videos on YouTube of people showing these going, this is the ultimate router, this is the best router ever, thumbnails of people holding up and screaming into the camera, you know, that sort of stuff. But actually, while this is an amazing device, hopefully, and it should be really good for my use case, there's definitely times where this is not necessarily as good as a USG. So let's take a look. So this is UniFi Dream Machine Pro. This is one of their Dream Machine lines, so it is a separate product line to things like the UniFi Security Gateway and Cloud Key. They've launched this, I think, start of last year, end of 2019 they launched these. They launched the Dream Machine and the Dream Machine Pro. Now, the Dream Machine is a little sort of cylinder type thing, a little tabletop thing that's got, I think, 4 or 5 network ports on it and a built-in access point. So essentially it's like a UniFi system in a box. It runs a UniFi controller, it has a UniFi router on it, and it has a UniFi access point built in. The UDM-Pro, on the other hand, this one here, is more designed for small business use or home use where you've got a rack, where you want something, you know, a bit bigger, a bit more powerful, and you don't mind having it in a rack. Although if you don't have a rack, you can obviously use this tabletop mount, or you could, for example, mount it vertically on a bracket and have it sort of mounted flat to a wall. The UDM-Pro has a slightly different feature set to the UDM. It doesn't have a built-in access point. You know, the idea with this is you'd use an external one, but what it does have is an internal hard drive bay you can use for UniFi Protect. So you can connect UniFi cameras to this and use it as an NVR for them. And we'll talk about that a bit later. Now, where this sits in the UniFi product line, I'm not sure, because a lot of people seem to see these as being a replacement for the UniFi security gateways. However, this is a bit different because it does most of the same jobs as a security gateway, but we'll talk about the software later, but it runs different software, and it can only be used with its built-in controller because this acts as a UniFi controller. You cannot adopt this to an external controller. So if you're deploying these in, say, a business environment where you've maybe got a centralized controller hosted in the cloud or on your own servers, and then you've got multiple devices out in the field, you can't actually use a UDM connected to that controller. You can only connect this to its own controller. Whereas if you had a USG, you can connect that to an external controller. So there are differences there. Now, this video is going to be 2 parts. This one, we're going to unbox it, take it out, try it out, install it in my rack, I'll show all that, and I'll do a setup of it. And I'll just talk about how it all works, how I set it all up, and then we'll try it out. In the next video, I'm going to do a teardown of it. So I'm going to take it apart, look at all the components, talk about how it's all laid out, and just take a look at the architecture, because there's a few little quirks around things like this built-in 8-port switch it has, and how that's all linked together. So I'll do a second part of that just to sort of split the video up a little bit. So yeah, as I mentioned, the UDM-Pro is like an all-in-one UniFi system, so it gives you the controller and the router all in one box, and the camera NVR if you want that. It can also run things like their access control and voice for their phones if you need to, and it's designed for small business use or home use, like high-end home use. And price-wise, this costs around £340, which is expensive, but actually when you look at the feature set and compare it to other things, it's not too bad. So what we'll do is we'll take it out of the box and take a look at it. So this is it here, quite a big box. They definitely sort of upgraded the packaging a little bit. This seems a bit better than the old one, but yeah, we can pull this open like that and see what we get. And yeah, as I mentioned, I don't really need this, but I'm just really excited to try it out because I've really wanted to sort of see one of these in person because I've always seen videos of them. But yeah, that's there, shows how to set it up. Just plug it in, use the app. It's a bit weird when they're like, yeah, when the first thing all the setup guides say use the app, not use a computer, which again, feels like they're targeting this at a smaller home use type thing, because yeah, I would never think of setting up a router on my phone as the primary option, but there you go. See what we get. Got a box here. Got a very bad angle to unbox this, but anyway, there we go. Got the box, see what comes with accessory wise. There we go. And in here we get a power cable. Now this is an EU power cable. This is something quite common with Ubiquiti stuff. I don't think they package them for the UK, so you almost always get an EU power cable. But then the seller, like the retailer, I think I bought this from box.co.uk, I think. The retailer tends to include a power cable, so I got a UK power cable with it as well. But for mine, I've actually bought a separate power cable because this is quite a bit deeper than anything else I've got in my wall cabinet. And I'll actually have to move stuff forward in the wall cabinet to fit this. So I've actually gone out and bought this right angle power cable just because hopefully it'll go a bit less deep into the rack than say that one. So hopefully that means I won't have to worry about the depth as much, because yeah, it's quite a bit deeper, but yeah. Comes with a EU power cable, but the retailer did include one. Then you get the rack ears, so these will mount on the side of the UDM. Try that out as well. And then just, yeah, a little quick start guide manual thing. You just get this little box here of mounting accessories, I think. Sounds like it. Yep. So, I mean, that is a nice presentation, isn't it? That's quite nice. So what you're going to get here is you're going to get some rubber feet, so if you want to stand on a table, it comes with those. You also get some smaller screws and some larger screws. I think the larger screws look like they're to mount the rack ears on. Yeah, they would be. I honestly don't have a clue what these smaller screws are. Interesting. Take a look at that later. Maybe replacement case screws, but... Oh, that's what they'll be. They'll be for the hard drive, because you can mount a hard drive in this for UniFi Protect, so they'll obviously be hard drive mounting screws. That makes a lot more sense. And then you get cage nuts. Now, I'm going to quickly look at these cage nuts because... Is this going to be... Yep, so this is still a slight gripe I have with Ubiquiti, and it's just something to bear in mind, and it's me being really pedantic, is that UniFi and Ubiquiti include cage nuts with all their kit, which I really like. It's really handy. But because they're an American company, the cage nuts and screws they include are imperial measurements, not metric. So I tend to avoid using these on purpose, because in the UK and presumably in the rest of Europe, generally we use metric screws and metric cage nuts, usually M6 or M5. And my problem is that anytime I put imperial ones in, they inevitably get mixed up in a bag of metric ones, and then you've got these cage nuts that you'll put in and then find the screw doesn't fit, and then you've lost the screw that actually fits it, and it's a nightmare. So yeah, come on Ubiquiti, if you're putting EU power cables in, put metric screws in, because yeah, that has driven me mad so many times when I've like put a device in, and then one of the cage nuts has ended up being imperial, and then I can't find an imperial screw to fit it. But yeah, I'm just moaning now. But let's take a look at the UDM. So slide that out. And possibly in the worst angle possible to try and do this over the camera. But here we go. And that's it there. Try and get that out of the way. Oh, smash everything in the process. And here it is. So definitely nicely packaged, a lot better than the old one used to be. It's in this nice foam, so hopefully that should be quite good for being robust across ship, like when it's being shipped. Pretty sure the old one just came in a cardboard box, with like a bit of foam on top. Definitely wasn't like this. Cool, so that comes off. And now here we have the UDM-Pro. So it's in a little bag. Let's just undo that. Ubiquiti always do a nice job on their packaging, which, you know, they're obviously targeting a bit more of a sort of slightly consumer audience, or just to produce something nice, because obviously most sort of business equipment just tends to come in a very boring box, but it is a nice experience. And there is the UniFi Dream Machine Pro. So that looks really, really nice there, actually. I really like the style of this new equipment they're doing, where they've got these like vents all on the top and the little LCD. And the problem is that I'm going to put this in a rack next to an older first generation switch, and I am absolutely convinced that it'll be maybe a few months before that bugs me, and I end up buying a newer switch, if only just so it matches this, just matches the aesthetic of this. But yeah, these new ones do look really nice. So what we'll need to do now is we'll just peel off all the plastic that's on the front. So there's this little bit of plastic covering the LCD. I presume it's an LCD, not an OLED. We'll take a look at that. Hopefully it isn't actually an LCD, because I mentioned in my previous video that my Cloud Keys LCD, Cloud Keys OLED, has like got screen burn over the years, so I presume it's LCD hopefully. And then here we've got this little hard drive bay, so is that just, yeah, so you push it in, that comes out, that's the hard drive bay, and then there's a bit of tape on it, so just take that off there, because I think that's just, I presume that's just, that's what it is, it's to hold the front shut, I think, when it's being shipped, so it doesn't pop open. So we can take that out like that. So there we go. So what I'll now do is I'll install the rack ears, and we'll come back and take a tour of the hardware. Okay, so now let's put the rack ears on. That's them there. What's quite good is the screws are in a proper square pattern, so if you wanted to, you could actually mount it like that and then use it as a way to mount it to like a wall, which could be quite useful in certain environments if you don't want a full rack for this. Although generally when it comes to things like that, I tend not to do that. You can get quite cheap brackets, I can't really call them, just like a vertical rack bracket or something, or vertical 1U bracket or something. They're basically, you can screw to a wall and then actually attach the equipment on using the rack ears, and they tend to like mount a little bit better. They've got more mounting holes and stuff, so that's potentially an option as well. Plus you can get ones that are like 2U, so you could fit this next to a switch, but still have it vertically, which can be really good in a sort of tightly constrained cupboard. Yep, put these in. And then we can do the other side as well, and then we'll fire it up and try it out. So start it there, shut the ears on the other side, and then I'll come back. So now let's take a tour of the UDM-Pro. So if we look at the front first of all, we can see we've now got the rack ears on, and on the left-hand side you've got this little screen. Now this is actually a touch screen as well, so you can kind of get status of the device and do very basic operations with it, so it's quite nice like that. I suspect, for example, you can maybe tell it to do like a safe shutdown and stuff, but it's mostly a bit of eye candy just to get a bit of information out of it. This also does that UniFi AR stuff where like this will show a QR code, you'll scan it on your phone with an app, and then your phone will kind of, on its camera, will superimpose all the connections and cables that are coming out of it, so you can see what's connected. I'll probably try it out. I don't know how useful it really is in practice, but it is a bit of fun, and it's, yeah, it uses that screen there. You then got these air vents along the top, your hard drive bay, 8 gigabit Ethernet ports for the LAN side, a gigabit Ethernet port for the WAN side, and then a pair of SFP Plus ports that can either be 10 gig or 1 gig, one for WAN, one for LAN. So we'll take a quick look at the hard drive mounting first, just because it's probably a bit less to go into than the networking side. But the hard drive cage pops out with a single button there, pulls out like that, and you can mount a hard drive. And I noticed it came with 5 screws, but the manuals explained what it is. So with this you can mount a 2.5-inch drive or a 3.5-inch drive. For a 2.5-inch drive you just align it in this corner here, put the 4 screws in the bottom, and that mounts it. For a 3.5-inch drive it's not toolless, but it's quick to install. So what you have is you've got this little mechanism here, and then this sort of notch here, or little knob sticking out. And the idea is you'll line your hard drive, and you can then clip it in, and it clips in basically toollessly. And then there's one screw here that you can use to put that final screw in to secure it in place. So that's kind of nice, I suppose. I guess that explains why they've done that. Now, I actually won't be using a hard drive in this for UniFi Protect. I'm going to continue using my Cloud Key, and I'll explain that later. But yeah, you can put a hard drive in there for UniFi Protect, and I think you can go up to, presumably, well over 10 terabytes of storage in this. Although equally, if you wanted a lot of storage and you're really serious about your camera stuff, they also do the UniFi NVR, which can take 4 hard drives, and it then supports things like RAID. So that might be a better option because it's not that expensive. Because of course with this, you've only got a single drive, so if it fails, you're going to lose all the data that's on it. But yeah, that's there. The only thing I've found is there isn't like any way to like secure that and stop someone pulling the drive out. Now, obviously, ideally you just mount this in a secure location, but it would have been quite nice, for example, if there's a way to like put a screw through the bottom into this just to stop a casual person pulling it out. And then you can mount it in a rack with potentially security screws and just make it a bit harder to get access to, but yeah, the hard drive pulls out there. Next up on the right, we've got all the network connections. So this is when things get a little bit interesting. And something I've seen a lot of people very confused by as well. So now for the simplest side that requires very little explanation, we have this side here. You've got an SFP Plus port, you've got 2 SFP Plus ports, and a gigabit Ethernet port. 2 of these have little blue globe symbols next to them, and these are your WAN connections. So you can either connect your internet connection into the gigabit port over copper on a RJ45 cable, or you can connect it into the SFP port and either run it at 10 gig or 1 gig, you can choose, and then you can connect and say over fiber. These have little covers in that pull out that they aren't the rubber ones they used to do, they're a bit harder to get out, but they also look a bit smarter when they're in there, I suppose. So yeah, you've got for your WAN option, you've got either gigabit Ethernet or 1 gig or 10 gig SFP+. Next up down here, you've got port 11. This is a 10 gig LAN port. So again, this is SFP+, so you can do 1 gig or 10 gig, and you could uplink that into one of their Pro switches at 10 gig. And that would mean you'd have a much higher sort of uplink to your router, which could potentially help for things like inter-VLAN routing, because this would be able to route at way beyond 1 gig. So that's quite good, and it's definitely an upgrade over the USG Pro. Now, one thing I'm not sure about here is whether these are assignable. I don't think they are, because it could be nice, for example, to have the 2 SFP pluses set on the LAN side, because that's usually going to be more useful for most people. Most people don't have 10 gig WAN connections. But yeah, it'd be nice if they were assignable, but I don't think they are. So that's the WAN and 10 gig LAN side of it. But what about 1 gig LAN? Well, for that, you've got these 8 gigabit Ethernet ports here. And this is something that's a little bit of a weird design decision they've done here. And it's something that I've seen a lot of people online talking about and then using the wrong terminology and getting confused, and then other people reading the wrong terminology and misinterpreting it and getting even more confused, and lots of really confusing stuff going about online, which is why I also want to properly test this. But you do have 8 gigabit Ethernet ports on here, but this isn't equivalent to, say, building a pfSense box with 8 NICs in it, or buying a router from lots of other companies that have 8 NICs in them. This is a switch. So this is more equivalent to having, say, imagine an external 9-port managed switch, where one of the ports is plugged into the CPU on this, and the other 8 ports are available for use. That's what you've got here. You've got 8 ports externally, and this is then connected to the main CPU over a single port. Now, it is managed, so you can set VLANs and do all that sort of stuff on it. But the downside of this is it's uplinked to the main CPU at 1 gigabit. Now, that's where I've seen a lot of people getting confused online, because people have then said that means, I've referred to this as having a 1 gigabit backplane, and then other people are then hearing that and then assuming this has like 1 gigabit of total switching capacity, which isn't correct. Like, any switch has, enough switching capacity to allow all of its ports to communicate at the same time at full speed. But what it does have is a 1 gigabit uplink. That means if you've got devices connected to this, if they're all on the same subnet or VLAN, and they're all plugged into this, they can communicate with each other at full gigabit speed. You could have, 8 devices, and then 4 of them could be sending data to the other 4 at full gigabit constantly, and that would be fine. However, if you've then got traffic that needs to traverse that 1 gig link from this to the main CPU, you're going to be bottlenecked. So for example, if you've got devices on this on different VLANs or different subnets that are going to need to be routed by the router, that traffic's then going to pass over that 1 gig link and then come back to the switch, and that's going to be a bottleneck. Potentially more annoyingly though, it seems as though the uplink comes from here to the main CPU at 1 gig, and then the 10 gig LAN port is also connected directly to the CPU. It's not like you've got a switch here where the 10 gig port is part of the switch. That means if you've got, say, a switch uplinked at 10 gig, and then you've got devices plugged into this, say 8 devices in here, if those 8 devices want to then talk to your 10 gig switch, they internally have to go over that 1 gig connection, which will again bottleneck them. Interestingly, I was looking at some stuff online, and it seems like when they initially developed the UDM-Pro, this was uplinked at 2.5 gig to the main CPU, which still isn't amazing, but it's at least something. It could allow, communication going both ways, and it would be a little bit better. But apparently there was an issue that when they had that, it meant that you could only run the 2 SFP plus ports at the same speed as each other. So if you wanted, for example, have a 10 gig link into an internal switch, your WAN SFP plus would also run at 10 gig. You couldn't have one of these set to 10 gig and one of these set to 1 gig. So they decided to change it and instead have this linked at 1 gig, but allows you to have separate speeds on these, which is maybe better. But that's just worth bearing in mind that this is a 8-port switch. It will work normally like an 8-port switch. Devices on this can communicate perfectly fast with each other, but anytime it needs to go through the main CPU, it will be slowed down. So don't think of this as 8 individual NICs. Think of this as being a 9-port switch where one of the ports is connected into this at 1 gig. So yeah, you probably want to be a bit careful about when you use this. So don't, for example, connect a bunch of servers to this, for example, and then have all your clients hanging off the SFP port because they're going to be bottlenecked by that link. It could be useful for, say, in a home environment, if you've got like hubs for like Hue lights or your Hive heating, you could plug that sort of thing in. Or, if you've got like like management controllers on servers, they could go in, that sort of stuff. It's just a bit annoying. And I think the only other thing with this is I wish this had been PoE, because it's not a PoE switch. Because if these switch ports were PoE capable, that would make it a much more sort of valuable proposition, because this acts as an NVR. And if you could plug all your cameras directly into this and power them over PoE, that would be fantastic, because you don't need really any more than the 1 gig uplink for cameras, and it would just actually give this a use. But because it's not PoE and you've got that uplink that's restricting it, it's a little bit of a niche use, but it does have it there. But I think for me, at first, I'm just going to connect it with a single cable into my switch, and eventually if I ever get a new switch that's got a 10 gig uplink, I'll be using the SFP Plus port, and I think I'll only ever use these for really low bandwidth devices if I really just need extra ports and I don't have them on my switch. So now here we are in the back of it. You've got these air outlets, I presume it's front to back airflow, so you've got those vents there. And along here, you've now got an IEC power inlet. So this is actually better than the old USG. The old USG had a cloverleaf input for some reason, and it meant that if you're in a data center and you've only got IEC cables sitting around, it could be a bit of a pain, so having built an IEC is quite nice. Annoyingly, I'm also seeing a warranty seal there, so that might be a bit of a problem for the teardown, but we'll see. If it works, I might do it, we'll see. But I might wait a little while before I do that, just to make sure it's definitely working. But now over here, you can see we have this big interesting connector labelled USP Connect. And if we pull this cover out, what you'll see under there is what's almost like an ATX power connector. It's not, presumably, but it's just a large, giant multi-pin connector designed for power. And you can see next to it, it's labelled USP RPS, off or on, for this LED. And this is for their new RPS system. The RPS is a 1U unit that has 6 power outputs, and all it is a big external DC power supply. I've seen people calling it a UPS and stuff like that. It's not, it's just a DC power supply. But the idea is that you can then feed DC into this to power it, and power the device over AC here. Now there's a few reasons you might want to do that. The first one you have is just, if you're worried about the power supplies and your switches or routers failing, having this could be a sort of backup. But that's not really that common, because it's rare that power supplies fail. I mean, they do, but it's also, you've still got the risk of like the main CPU or the main processor or whatever failing. So that's not usually why you would do it. Usually you do that in higher end, say, business environments, data centers, comms rooms and big buildings, where what you might have is multiple circuits feeding all your equipment. And that can be to the level of literally 2 power feeds coming from different energy sort of parts of the grid into your building. They can come from separate substations and stuff like that. Or you might just want to run it off 2 separate circuits. And that means if one of those circuits or power feeds goes down, you can keep powering it. So for example, if the power feed feeding all the mains IEC inputs goes down, the RPS can continue to power all the equipment in your rack, which could be really useful. That's obviously only really in higher end environments like really high end office buildings or data centers, so it's not hugely common, but it could be quite nice to have. Another example could be if you wanted to like run this off a UPS. What you could potentially do is, for example, connect the UPS into all the mains inputs and then connect your RSP just into the mains without the UPS. And it then means if you ever need to take the UPS down for maintenance, you can continue to power all your stuff so you don't need to power it down. For me in a home environment, there's really no need for that at all. It would just be a lot of extra money because it is a good couple £100 and it would provide very little benefit. Like, I'm thinking here, the only time I could really benefit from it would be that because I've got a split load consumer unit, I could potentially power the rack from 2 different RCDs using the RPS. And it means if I trip an RCD, which I do far too often, I could, keep the rack powered, but I mean, that's rare. It's definitely not worth a couple £100 to keep it up. But yeah, that's what that is there. And this is quite good to see because they've now got this across all of their sort of new generation equipment. So that's their UDM, their new switches, including the PoE ones. And I think even their camera NVRs and stuff, they all now support this. So that means that all your UniFi equipment can now be dual powered. And this is something that a lot of other vendors do as well. I mean, Cisco have been doing this for years. Sure, yeah, I've got a couple of Allied Telesis switches that also have this sort of style of DC input, obviously a different one, but a similar idea. And it is a really good way of doing it because it means you now don't need to pay anymore to have a second DC power supply in all your switches, especially if you don't want it. You can just plug that in and buy a separate device. The only negative of this over their old stuff comes on the lower end switches, like the non-PoE ones, such as my UniFi US24s. Those did actually support redundant power. What they had was the IEC mains input, and next to that was a little DC barrel jack that you could feed 25 volts DC into. I think you needed, fairly high current. I think 50 watts rings a bell, but don't quote me on that, check the spec sheet. But you could feed that in there, and if you fed the DC in, or the mains in, it would power it. So you could redundantly power them like that. I've never done that on a UniFi switch, but I have done it before with edge switches, and what I've been able to do is connect the internal power supplies to one feed, and then just buy a relatively inexpensive DC power brick from RS Components, and use that to power the redundant DC input from the second power feed. Now that's only a case on the lower end switches, and with those it meant that none of the higher end switches or the PoE switches supported it. So you do have the benefit of all devices being able to support it now. But what it does mean is that on those lower end non-PoE switches, you now have to spend a significant amount of money for the external RPS unit, which is, a good couple £100 if not more. Whereas previously you could buy a power brick for under £50 and plug it in. So that's the only disadvantage, is just that on the lower end switches you now have to buy a much more expensive unit to power them. But it does mean that all the devices can now be redundantly powered. So I think that's a sort of sacrifice that's worth making. And realistically, if you're in an environment where you can where you've got redundant power feeds and stuff, you can probably afford to buy the RPS. It's not designed for home use at all. But yeah, that's it there. So that's the back of the UDM there. Definitely seems like a really nice device, very heavy, and I'm holding this at a really bad angle to film. But yeah, definitely seems like really nice hardware, so I'm really excited to get this in the rack and try it out. So now before I start taking the rack apart and ripping everything out to, make space for this, what I'll do is I'll quickly power up on the table here, just to try out and see if I can get at least into the setup wizard. That way I can just verify it is working before I start putting it into the rack. So yeah, let's go and do that. Okay, so now we're finally ready to try it out. So this will be the full setup, I'll get it in the rack for that, but I just want to check it works because I don't want to, rip the whole rack apart and then find there's a problem with it. So I'll bring a laptop in there. What we'll do is we'll connect the laptop in with Ethernet, and hopefully, I'm presuming it'll just give the laptop an IP address and connect to the UDM's IP, and it'll give me some sort of setup interface. I don't really fancy using the mobile app, so plug that in there. That. And then plug that into the laptop, and then hopefully if I plug in the power cable, UDM should start up. Just find that in there. There we go. That's now plugged in there. Oh, I haven't switched the socket on, that explains why it's not on. And there we go, so we can see the screens come on in it. And it says USG-Pro is starting. Or UDM-Pro, sorry, but yeah. If you just wait for that to boot up, I can see it's now got a link on the port the laptop's connected to. It's gone away again though. But this seems to be booting up, so it works. And the other good thing I've noticed is I can't hear that. Either the fans are off or running at like a super low speed. So obviously it'll be interesting to actually try it all properly once it's, see what the fan's noise is like when it's actually got load on it or it's actually being used. But as far as I can tell right now, that's almost silent, which compared to the old USG, which you'll have seen in my previous video, is quite loud. Like you can hear the fan noise, even like if you're standing outside the cupboard it's in and you listen carefully, you can hear the fan. So this being silent is pretty nice. Now I imagine it won't be silent if you're pulling, trying to route and do IDS and IPS at 10 gig, because that's quite intensive, but being silent just under normal operation is quite good. So it's taking a really long time to boot up, but I suppose it is booting a full Linux system, so yeah. There we go. So it's now up there and it's saying plug-in cable. So I suspect it's telling me to plug in a WAN connection now, because it's saying plug-in cable and it's pointing at the WAN port, so I also need to connect an external network connection into that. Now I've got one here I'll use. Now this obviously is a LAN connection for me. It's not a WAN connection, but it'll do, just to hopefully let me set it up. Obviously in actual practice this will be going into my modem, but if we plug that in there, hopefully it's got a link there. And yep, it's now saying WAN cable plugged in, connecting to the network, connecting to the internet. Okay, yeah. So that's the one thing I found with this. Yeah, so now it's saying internet connected, it's showing an IP and gateway, which obviously is on my LAN side, but it is showing it's connected to the internet. Now that is one thing we'll talk about with this, is that it does require an internet connection to get it set up, which is a bit of a problem. So it's now saying there I'm to get the UniFi app and set it up, presumably through that. And what it'll do is it'll use Bluetooth to like help the app find the device. There'll be other videos of that working, but I really don't want to set this up on a phone, you know. I don't get the obsession with, oh, I can't wait to configure my network on my phone for the first time. So hopefully, if we go in here, I can find out what IP it's got. 192.168.158, so I'll try 192.168.151.1.1. Cool, there we go. So that's giving me the UniFi web interface. So you don't need to use the app, you can use that. And you can see on the screen there, it's now saying, yep, setting up, and it's showing a picture of a laptop, which pretty amusingly, I'm pretty sure that's like the macOS snow leopard wallpaper they're showing on that picture of a laptop, but yeah, it's quite nice. And now we have the initial setup wizard. So it seems to be working. Obviously I'd have to go through here and name the device, press next, all that sort of stuff. But I won't do that right now. I'll get it put out in the rack and then we'll set it up there once all the other equipment's installed as well. But it seems to work. So what that now means is now we need to go out, take all the current equipment out of my rack, and then install this. So that's going to be fun. Okay, so here we've got the current setup in my hall cupboard cabinet. I've made loads of videos about this before, but I'll quickly go through it. At the top here, we've got a 24 port patch panel. Almost all of these ports go off to network ports on the walls or in the flat. Then there's like one for the access point, a couple for cameras, and on the right hand side, the rightmost one is actually connected to my master socket, and that's a DSL phone line extension that I think on RJ45 to RJ11 cable that connects my modem up. Below that we've got a PoE injector. That's because I don't have a PoE switch. That's potentially a thing that I might get in the future. But currently I'm just using this, which is an 8-port rack mount PoE injector, so I can just patch cables from the switch through that and provide PoE to things like the access point and cameras. Next up we've got the part we're replacing, which is the Security Gateway Pro. This has been absolutely fine, it's been a really good router, but that's what I've been taking out and putting the UDM-Pro in instead. We've then got my CloudKey Gen 2 Plus, which is currently running the UniFi controller and UniFi Protect for the cameras. With this, I'll be keeping UniFi Protect running on this, but I'll be taking the controller off obviously and running on that on the UDM. And when we do the setup of the UDM, I'll talk about why I'm keeping this for UniFi Protect and not using the UDM. They also sell a rack mount kit for this, which is fairly expensive. It's about £100, but I could get that in the future. I've not ever bothered yet, but I might do that at some point. I'm just using a shelf at the moment. And on the right hand side here, we've got my OpenReach modem. So this is just a BT OpenReach VDSL modem, and that's what I use for my broadband. So it connects up into the phone extension up there, and then into the USG. Finally down here, we've just got this PDU, which is just a standard 6-port one with the UK plugs. It's not smart or managed or anything. It does the job though. That's there, and then flex out of that comes out the bottom of the rack. Since actually I did the first video, I've since put a sort of metal plate in here and put a grommet to let the cable come out, so it's a lot neater because it doesn't just dangle out a big square hole. And that cable runs round the cupboard and plugs into a socket to power it. So that's all I've got there. Now, while I'd love to just pull the USG out and slot the UDM straight in, we can't really do that. There's going to be a bit of a problem. And that's because if we measure the UDM-Pro with the power cable in the back, even using the right-angled power cable, it's 31.5 centimeters deep. However, if we measure this cabinet from the front to the back, the cabinet itself's deep enough, but where the rails are currently mounted, they're only about 27 centimeters from the back, so it wouldn't fit, it would sit too far forward. Now this cabinet is adjustable, and it's a total of 390mm deep, so what I can do is I can take some equipment out. I'll probably need to take most of it out, to be honest. There's then screws at the top and bottom I can loosen off, take the cage nut out, and then move the whole assembly forward a bit, which means the cables will get a little bit more squished, but there's currently enough space, I think, because they sort of stop at this lip here, but the glass door actually sits way in front of them, so I suspect that it'll be tighter for the cables, but I think I'll manage. I'll also see how I feel about the patch panel, because currently it's at the very top. So I'll need to see when I move this forward, will I still be able to get the cables in and out, or are they going to get caught under this lip, in which case I'll drop the patch panel down 1U. But we'll see how we get on with that. So all it's left to do now is power all this equipment down, pull it all out, adjust the rails, and set it all up again. Okay, so here we can see the progress I've made. So I've just taken everything out, and then I've dropped the patch panel down a couple of U. The reason is that to adjust these screws to move the things, there's like a cage nut inside, and there's a screw down here, and then one up at the top there. So I've just dropped the patch panel down a couple of U, so it's at least secured in, so it's not hanging by the cables or anything, and that'll let me get a screwdriver in to get stuff out. Everything else I've pulled out, just left the shelf in because it's in the middle anyway, and it's not heavy, so it doesn't really matter. And then for the PDU, because the cable's just sort of, it's a really long flex, attached to the wall, I can't really pull it out. I've just unmounted it and just stuck it at the back there, and that'll let me get a screwdriver in to move these forward. So all I'll need to do now is go in, pop these screws out, move all the rails forward, and just try and work out how far I need to move them forward to get enough clearance for the UDM, but without moving them too far forward and just crushing the cables up against the glass. So go away and try that, and we'll come back. Okay, so now I moved the bars forward, and I was quite lucky because you can only really on this rack put it into specific positions based on those cage nut cutouts. I suppose you can maybe cut the gap between two of them and slide it in the middle or something, but yeah, without modifying it, you can only fit it in those individual positions. And this one I've got it in is exactly 31.5 centimeters from the back. So like, that is the closest it could possibly be. And if it hadn't fitted in this position, I'd have had to bring it even further forward, and that would like lose me loads of cable space and give loads of wasted space at the back. So I got quite lucky there. Now it is a lot closer to the front now than it used to be, but I think it'll be fine if I like plug a cable in like that into the patch panel, like that, say for example. It'll obviously need to bend down or up, but the door still shuts perfectly fine over that, so there's no problem there at all really. I think we're okay. It'll be tight when I put all the cables in, but I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm probably going to replace these with like those slimmer cables at some point. But yeah, seems good. What I think I'll do though is, like I mentioned earlier, I don't think I want to put the patch panel right back into the top slot, just because you can still get the cables in and out, but it'll be a lot fiddlier than it was before, and it was already a bit fiddly. What I'll do, I don't really need that extra space. I mean, on this rack, it isn't even numbered. This is officially a 6U rack that just happens to have an extra U at the top and bottom that you could maybe put something in, but so it's got an additional, it's essentially got 8 U's, but only 6 are numbered. So this isn't even really an official U because you can't get a screwdriver into either properly. So I'll drop the patch panel down to this one here. That'll be fine because I've always had a spare space in it. And if in the future I did need that extra U, I could either move it back up or I could put another thing in the top slot. It would only ever really be if I got a rack mount for the cloud key. In that case, I would still need a shelf for the modem. But what I could do in that case is I could put the shelf up the top and put the modem in the very top or something where it's not really needed to be accessed. So that's fine. So what I'll do is I'll put the patch panel here, drop the shelf down 1U, and then get all the new equipment installed. Okay, so that's it all done. All the equipment's now in. And I always love how neat this all looks without any cables. I'm always like, oh, can I just keep it like this without cables? But no, I need the cables. But yeah, that all fitted absolutely fine. So I've dropped the patch panel down one new just so it's here, much more accessible. PoE injector here, the existing switch I already had, and now I've got the Dream Machine in. Putting it all in did make me realise that I didn't really go about it the right way, because I put the UDM and then tried to feed all the power cables up the back and then couldn't get in because the UDM goes right to the back. But it does fit fine. And I've checked, and the new PoE switches, like the 24-port Pro PoE switch, is the same depth as the UDM. So it means if I got that in the future, I can just replace the power cable with another right-angled one, and I know it'll fit. I don't need to do this ever again, hopefully. And I did think about potentially, get a deeper rack, but the problem with that is that I'd have to try and replace this. The patch panel's already run through it and stuff, and it'd take up more cupboard space than I need. And this should be fine. The door will shut over it, which is good. So yeah, that's all installed. Now I need to get it all cabled up, and then we can fire it up. Okay, so now I've got it all cabled up, and that was a bit of an epic because a few different issues I had. The first one I had was when I went to plug in the modem. I realised that now because this PDU is further forward, the power brick wouldn't plug in with the PDU in place. So I tried pulling the PDU out, but then couldn't get the power brick back in with this shelf in. So I had to take the shelf out, plug the modem in, put the PDU back in, and then put the shelf back in. So it's definitely not ideal, but really it's the only option other than move the PDU up on you and then put the shelf on the top, I suppose, but then it makes it harder to access this kit. So yeah, it's not ideal, and in hindsight, if I'd had a deeper rack it would have been fine, but you can't predict necessarily needing replacing a thing several years down the line. And the thing is, I'd rather have a shallower rack if I can at least fit it, even if it's a bit inconvenient, than have a much bigger rack that juts out into the cupboard and takes up loads of space. So that was fine. Now that's done, we've got everything mounted. The only other difficulty I had was when I was cabling it all. I just hadn't really thought, and that was something, first of all, obviously it's a lot tighter because the door is closer to the cables. But the problem is also that these cables have been sitting here for like 2+ years plugged in, and it means that they've kind of like naturally bent into a suitable sort of shape and position. And when I just took them out, I just pulled them out, threw them in a bag, and went to plug them in again. So they're all plugged obviously into different ports. And it meant that some of them, like the connectors, were twisted, so they wouldn't necessarily, they were lining up the opposite way up from what they needed to be. Or some of them were bent to be really, stretched to be really long, some were bent to be short. And I put them all in the wrong holes and then couldn't necessarily get them all to fold flat, so that was pretty annoying. The door does shut now. I've had to really squish them in and it looks like a total mess, but that's just because of the only way I get the door to shut is just properly squeeze them back and then shut the door. This did happen when I first put it all in, so what I suspect will happen is after maybe, a few months or whatever of having this installed with the door shut, the cables will slowly start to like, remember their new shape and sort of bend into that sort of new shape, and they'll stay in, and it'll be much easier to shut the door afterwards. So I'm sure it'll be fine. And as I've mentioned, I might replace these with something like the slim run cables. Additionally, I also don't really need all of the ports patched in. Like, obviously a lot of these do have devices on them, but not all of them do. So I could just take a lot of the cables out and only patch the ones I need. So that's another option as well. Nothing really much to report, so we can go through it again. So we've got all the ports on the top that go out to all the rooms. They're all connected into devices here. I've got rough colour coding where the orange cables just go to like end devices. The yellow cables go to end devices and ports and stuff, but they're generally like a sort of trunk through the network. So like this one goes to my access point, these two go to a different switch, this one connects the router to the modem, and the router to the switch and stuff like that. So the yellow ones kind of mean they're like network backbone almost, and then the blue ones are cameras. We've then got the PoE injector installed, and certain devices are patched through this. So I've patched through the access point, the cameras, the cloud key, because I'm just powering that over PoE, and my Raspberry Pi I use for my home automation. Then everything connects into the switch, either directly or through the PoE injector. And down here we can see we've got the UDM-Pro connected to the switch using this SFP RJ45 module. That's just to give me an extra port because the switch is currently full, apart from these two, but that's just again, a link across the top for HDMI. So I thought, well, I may as well use this extra port here, so that's just frees up all the switch ports to be used for the patch panel. So SFP to RJ45, an RJ45 cable going into the switch port on the UDM-Pro. Then for the internet connection, I've also got the DSL line comes in from the patch panel up there on the top right, comes down here into the modem, and this green cable comes out the modem into the WAN port on the UDM. So that, after an epic of rearranging everything and pulling equipment out several times to try and get everything to fit, it's all now installed. So what I now need to do is go and fire it up and just do the setup. Now, whereas if you're installing this normally and you're doing this, as a sort of, I don't know, if you're replacing the existing thing, what you could definitely do is back up your old UniFi controller config, restore it onto the UDM-Pro, and it would just behave like your old one. With me, because my config was so old and now I've done a bunch of updates, there's weird differences between what my config has in it and what the new UniFi controller offers. There's slight differences, and it's just a bit messy. So what I want to do is to set it all up from scratch. And it means I can sort of show the setup process as well. So what I'll do is I'll go and set all this up, but first of all, I'm going to go through, factory reset all my existing devices, and we'll come back and do the first power up of the UDM-Pro. Okay, so now off camera, I factory reset all the UniFi devices. So all you do is just hold in the reset button on them all, and then until the white light goes white, and then it's reset. So I've done that to the two switches and the access point, so they're now all ready. I then unplugged the Cloud Key Gen 2 Plus and the cameras from the PoE injector just so they're not going to get powered. I probably won't set these up on this video, but I'll need to reset this as well and reset the cameras up and stuff. But I've already done a video about the UniFi Protect CCTV stuff, so there's no point showing that again on this video. So I've unplugged that for now just so it doesn't confuse things. So all we need to do now is if we turn the power on, everything should start up. So turn the main power on. That fan noise is actually the switch. The UDM is silent, but the switch's fan turns off once it's booted up. And we see the UDM is starting. So we can let that start up. And then once that starts up, I'll plug the laptop into the network over Ethernet, and we can do the initial setup. Okay, so that's everything now started up, and the fan on the switch is turned off, so it's totally silent now, which is really nice compared to that old USG that did have quite a noticeable fan noise. And now we can see on the UDM, it's now saying no IP address found, restart your modem. This is like what we saw on the table where it requires an internet connection to really get past the initial setup. That's pretty bad instructions because it says restart your modem, but it's because my modem here uses PPPoE, and because that's not set up, it's not going to get an IP address. So, if you're a total sort of novice setting this up, you could just sit in like indefinitely restarting your modem wondering why it's still doing this, because it's not that my modem needs restarted, it's because I've not set up the PPPoE settings. But as you can see there, it's now saying advanced setup, use a mobile app, or presumably a laptop as we saw earlier. So I'm going to ignore this message here because it's not set up. Jump over to laptop, plug it in, and try and set this up. Okay, so that's all the equipment now powered up, and all the devices are just sitting with white LEDs, which means they're ready to be adopted to the controller. And what's really good with all the UniFi stuff is that when all the switches are set are just factory reset, they work as unmanaged switches, which means that I'm actually sitting right now at my desk with my laptop plugged into its docking station, which is then plugged into a switch, and then that switch is then connected to another switch, and that switch is then uplinked to the router. So because they're all acting unmanaged, my laptop is working absolutely fine. I don't need to plug straight into the UDM, which is good. You can see here my laptop's now got an IP address over DHCP automatically, so that's really good. 192.168.1.227. So I imagine if I just go to 192.168.1.1, that'll get me into the UDM. So there we go. Like this time-elapse thing, it's like trying to show you how amazingly quick it is to set up. But you can see it's sitting here saying connecting to internet, and it's trying to connect. Now it'll never be able to do that with my connection because it's PPPoE, so it needs a username and password. So if we press advanced internet options, it lets me set up my internet connection. So it's trying to use DHCP, which isn't right. We'll need to use PPPoE. I'll need to fill in my username and password for my connection. Okay, so now I've put my username and password in. What is really good here actually is you can say to use a VLAN. Now, that's not something I need with my modem. The OpenReach modem doesn't require a VLAN. But if you're using an OpenReach connection and you're using certain modems, you actually do need to set a VLAN tag. And it's really good it supports that, because I was thinking, what if you have a modem that isn't an OpenReach modem, just an aftermarket VDSL modem? Does this have the facility to set a VLAN? But it does. Because I was thinking, yeah, if it didn't have that, you'd have to, run it through a switch or something. So yeah, I don't need that, but that does mean you could use this with a modem that does require VLANs. Admittedly, this is really annoying. I don't really like the idea that it requires an internet connection just to do the initial setup, but we'll just put up with it for now. DNS servers will leave as default. I assume it'll get over PPPoE. Connecting. There we go. So now it's testing for an internet connection again, and hopefully this will now connect. And there we go. So it's connected to the internet, so that just worked straight away, which is really good. Hit next. No, don't do that. So now it's asking me to set this up, so I'll just call it UDM-Pro, that'll do. Agree to terms of service, fine. And now this is where I have a major problem with the UDM and the way UniFi is going with things. So I'm going to rant now, but anyway. With the UDM and the cloud keys with their latest firmware, you now must have a UniFi account to set them up. Now, this is something I really don't like. I was aware of this before I bought it, so I was basically setting myself up to have this rant anyway. But yeah, even though these devices can work totally standalone, totally offline, and don't have to have remote management enabled, you still need to use a UniFi account to set them up. Now, this is a big complaint I have, because if you've got a self-hosted UniFi controller, you don't, thankfully, and I really hope they don't change it to make that a requirement. But because you can't even use a UDM with a self-hosted controller, if you buy a UDM, you have to use a UniFi account. As I mentioned, you can turn the remote access off. You don't need to have all that enabled, so it can still operate kind of offline. I mean, if you wanted to, you could block all the UniFi servers and the firewall, but that would stop the updates working. But I don't like this because it means that, obviously for now, this will work totally fine. But what happens, say, 5 years down the line, if I'm still using this device, and Ubiquiti have decided to stop supporting it? Now, Ubiquiti are quite good at supporting old devices. They do support them generally to a point that by the time they deprecate them, they're kind of a bit useless anyway, or just a bit outdated in terms of performance. But what would happen, say, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, I or a business is still using a UDM-Pro and still wants to get it back working again. They've got no budget, they just need to get the thing up and running again. But something's gone wrong and they've had to factory reset it. If you then hit this stage where you have to now sign into a UniFi account, what could have happened by then is Ubiquiti could have, first of all, gone out of business, or they could have changed their login servers so that the login page here no longer works. If they've changed their login API, for example. And if we're assuming the device is now out of support, they've potentially not produced a firmware update to address that, to connect to that new API, and you could fairly easily get to a stage where you simply cannot log into it anymore because their APIs are no longer working with the firmware you've got. You also could have the risk of Ubiquiti just actually deciding to stop supporting devices and stop letting you log in, which could be really annoying if they decided to go down that route, because that could basically prevent you from setting up an older device. They could just say, no, we don't support it anymore, and you also can't set it up from scratch. I really hope they wouldn't do that, and I imagine there could potentially be legal issues if they just actually stopped people explicitly setting up a device. But yeah, the risk is that in the future, if they stop releasing firmware updates and then change their API for login, you could actually prevent people logging into this. So yeah, this is a complaint here, and I really wish they just didn't have that. They could just totally let you go past this and then optionally say, do you want to sign into a UniFi account for remote access? Yes or no, and you could skip it. I'm pretty sure you used to be able to do that on the cloud key with the older firmware. But anyway, we'll just have to put up with it. So I put my username and password in there, hit next. That's now done. So it's now logged me in and it's detected my account. So it was quick enough to do, but yeah, I don't like that. Update schedule, you can tell it to automatically do updates. I'm going to disable that and then I can manually install the updates, but you could set it to update automatically. However, I suspect that might end up restarting stuff as well, which is why you have to pick a schedule. So I'll just leave that undisabled. Hit next. Now here, there's some other things to do. Auto-optimize. It'll auto-optimize Wi-Fi and network performance. May as well leave that on, we'll see what it does later. And I'll leave diagnostics off. Hit next. Starting speed tests. That just tests my broadband. Ubiquiti does this, all they really do is you just test your broadband, and then it means that it knows how fast your connection is, so it can then compare the speed of your connection to the amount of traffic going through it, and literally just give you a graph of like how highly utilised your connection is. So let's let it finish that. And again, with this, I'm wondering in the setup process, again, similar to the login, if you say your firmware got out of date and they're no longer releasing new firmware for the device, what would happen at that speed test? Because that's enforced. If the speed test server changes and stops working or disappears, could you get to a point where you hit that, you get some sort of error because it can't connect to a speed test server that's no longer there, and then you just can't proceed past that in the setup stage? I do feel I wish this had like a way you could just skip the setup wizard, go straight into a totally blank UniFi controller and set it up from scratch without anything that could potentially be affected by external servers changing and firmware not being updated. But anyway, that's done. Found my broadband speed. Yeah, it's close enough. Okay, so that's now set up. So you can see it's now identified my account. It's created me as an owner/super admin with my UniFi account. You can then add local users that then aren't tied to your UniFi account, but I don't think you can remove your SSO, like your single sign-on UniFi account, which is a little bit problematic if you're, say, setting these up for other people. You would basically have to, you presumably wouldn't necessarily want your personal or your company's UniFi account sitting on all your clients' devices. So you potentially have to then set up UniFi accounts for lots of different people, and then, because you can't take the one that's the UniFi account that's signed in off of it, annoyingly. But anyway, so it's done that there, but you could add other users later, and I think it probably will. Now, you can see here it has defaulted to enabling remote access, so I'll be turning that off, because right now what I could do is go to the Ubiquiti website, log in, and manage it remotely. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Ubiquiti account device name is all set up, so hit finish, configuring your device, and hopefully we should then get into it. Now the good thing is this actually is a very quick setup process. I'm very impressed. Like, I mean, we're what? I'm actually using their time elapse now, but we're 8 minutes 50 in, and we're basically done with the initial setup, and I've been, stopping to talk about stuff and having a rant in the middle of it, so you probably actually get the setup in under 5 minutes, at least through this first step. So now it's doing updates, of course. So I may as well just let it do this, and I'll come back once it's done, because I don't know how long this is going to take. So the UDM is now updated, took a few minutes there, restarted a couple of times, now it's up. And this was just sitting on a white screen after a while, but I just refreshed it and it's taken me into this. So it's taken me into the UDM. About feedback, I could type a rant in there about making me have an account, but anyway. And that's it done. So here we can see the main interface. We'll take a look at this a little bit later, but what you can see is it's showing network, protect, access and talk. So these are the applications you can then install. So access and talk aren't set up, so access is for the access control and talk is for their new phones, but that's the beta. I'm not using those obviously. UniFi Protect is on this, but I won't be using that on here. As I've said, I'll run it on the Cloud Key and we'll explain that in a second. So we'll go into UniFi Network. So we go into here, takes a little minute, and that's it there. So we can see in the top right it's shouting, saying 3 network devices detected. And sure enough, I presume if I go down to clients, or not clients, if I go down to UniFi devices here, yep, we can see there's those 3 devices that are ready to add. That's my 2 switches and my access point. So I presume I could just go into either of those and just say adopt, or what if I press add in the top right? Will that just do it automatically? Possibly. So that's done something potentially, so hopefully if we go over to UniFi devices, yep, that's them all now. And still ready to add. What if I had to manually adopt them? There we go, so that notification didn't seem to do it, but we can just go into each of these, click the thing, click adopt. Just do it for all of them, that's exactly how it's always been, but it's obviously a little bit more slick than the old interface. Getting ready. I can see the switch next to me, the LED has gone blue, which is good, so it is now adopted. And that should be setting them all up, hopefully. Of course, everything's currently just connected over Wi-Fi, or over wired connection, so the Wi-Fi is just saying no clients because I've not set up any networks on it yet. But it seems to be working. See here, the UDM-Pro is saying experiences 1 gigabit, because obviously I've only got 1 gig connected to the switch. Obviously, if I had 10 gig connected to the 10 gig LAN side, I presume that would say 10 gig. That'll be a while off. But hopefully here that's all set up, so they're still all getting ready. Now, what I'll need to do is I'll need to go away off camera and just set up all the networks, because if we go into, for example, settings down here, this is give me a video now on how to do it. I've done that before, don't need it. Lots of tutorials and quick start guides and all this sort of stuff. But what I need to do now is set up Wi-Fi networks, local networks, all that sort of stuff. So that all still needs done because I've currently only got one LAN network. So I'll go away, set up all the networks, VLANs, Wi-Fi access point, or Wi-Fi SSIDs and all that sort of stuff. I'll just get it all working exactly how the old one used to work. Then I'll come back and show it all working and talk about my setup. Because I won't do a whole setup guide of all this like really in-depth stuff here because that's custom to my network. There's other videos out there that show how to do it and actually teach you how to learn how all this works so you can then design your own network. But I'll set all this up and come back and talk about the setup process. Okay, so I've now done the initial setup and I've been using it for quite a while, good few weeks now, just to try it out. So what we can now do is go through and talk about how I found it. So here I am in the main application itself. This is like the application and settings global to the UDM, not the individual applications like the UniFi controller. And we can see here it is running here, showing the CPU load and stuff down there. And you can see the CPU temperature is at 57.8 degrees, and that seems totally fine. It's classing that as pretty low, and the fans are totally off. And it's been totally silent as far as I can tell, so I'm really happy with it. Even under use in that cabinet, I don't notice any fan noise, which is fantastic. So this is our main interface here. We can go into like updates, and this shows all the applications. And what I've done here is I've updated it all, but I've turned off all the other applications. So I've stopped Protect, Access and Talk. They're all disabled. So all I have now running is UniFi Network. And this is just running the UniFi controller and nothing else. And yeah, it seems pretty good. So that's all working. But one thing I've mentioned quite a lot throughout this is the remote access. So let's take a look at that. So as you can see up here, I'm currently connected to the UDM on its local IP address on my LAN, and that's fine. But if we come over here, you can see we're now at unifi.ui.com. So even though I'm currently on the same local network as it, that's kind of inconsequential right now. I could be anywhere on the world on any internet connection or on any device, log into my UniFi account at this particular URL, and I'd be presented with this. And what you can see in here is there's my cloud key for my NVR, which I've talked about before, and here's my UDM-Pro. And if I click that, I can come into here, and I'm now into my UDM. And from here, I can go into things like UniFi Network, I can go into the system settings down here as well, and I can fully manage the device. Now, this is something that I really do not like. I can accept it for cameras, I can accept wanting to have cloud access to my cameras so I can check them if I'm away, but I do not want to have remote management access to my network. I just don't see the point to it. If I want to connect into my network to remotely manage it, I can use a VPN for that. And the reason I particularly buy UniFi equipment over alternatives such as Cisco's Meraki, Aruba Instant On, those sorts of platforms, is because it's remotely manageable and there isn't enforced cloud access. So I really don't like this, so I don't want to be using this remote management. Now, it is enabled by default, but you can turn it off, so that's fine. That means I'm happy to use it. So as you can see, we're in the cloud portal now, but if we come back over to the local portal and we go down to advanced, we can go through here, and if we scroll down here it is, you can see it says remote access. Now if I turn that off, it'll give me this little thing here, just give me a warning, press disable access, and that's now turned off remote access. So now if we come back over to the UniFi portal, refresh that page probably, yeah, it's still showing up there. But yeah, that's it, it's gone now. So it just took a little second, but you can see now the UDM has disappeared from my UniFi account. So now I can't remotely manage it, and that's how I want it. One little quick quirk I'll say, because it did confuse me for quite a while, is that you can only access this remote access option if you're logged into the UDM using your UniFi account. As I mentioned earlier, you can set up local users on the UDM, and I do that normally. But if you log into your local user, this option doesn't show up. So you need to explicitly log in with your UniFi credentials to be able to actually disable remote access, which is a little bit annoying. But there we go, I've disabled remote access, and now remote access is turned off, so I'm happy with the security of it all again. However, this is why I've kept saying throughout that I'm keeping my cloud key for my cameras. I alluded to this in my previous video, but with this, you can see this remote access setting is global to the UDM. It's not for individual applications. So it's not possible for me to say, have remote access enabled for UniFi Protect, but disable it for UniFi Network. It's all or nothing. So if I were to run UniFi Protect on my UDM, and I wanted cloud access enabled for UniFi Protect, I'd also have to have cloud access enabled for my UniFi controller. And unfortunately with UniFi Protect, if you want to use the mobile app, you need to have cloud access enabled. Even if you just want to use it over your local network, you can't add it based on IP address, so you have to have the cloud account enabled. So this is actually one of the reasons I went for the UDM, was because I no longer was happy running the UniFi controller on my cloud key, because after that update, it meant I couldn't have cloud access enabled for UniFi Protect without also exposing cloud access from my UniFi network. So what I've now done is I've now dedicated the cloud key to be just an NVR with cloud access enabled, and the UDM-Pro is sitting with cloud access disabled, so it's running a UniFi controller locally. So yeah, I'm not going to be using the UDM-Pro for UniFi Protect, and that's purely because if I wanted to use a mobile app, I would need to enable remote access, and with that, I would also have remote access enabled for my UniFi network controller, so I've just disabled it for now. Now, if in the future Ubiquiti changed it so that I could add the UniFi Protect UDM into the app just based on the IP address, and I could use the app with remote access disabled, then I would be totally happy to move UniFi Protect onto the UDM and just use it over the local network or over a VPN. But for now, I'm going to leave remote access disabled. But yeah, that's how you disable remote access. But other than that, I've been very happy with it. So we'll jump into UniFi Network here. And it's working. So this is the new interface you're seeing here. And yeah, it looks really good. It gives you sort of Wi-Fi stuff. It shows, traffic going out and all this sort of thing. But it's just a sort of very high level summary. It's very aesthetically pleasing anyway. On the left here, we can go through different devices. We can look at topology. It gives me a nice little graph of how the network's all laid out, which is quite cool. So you can see we've got the UDM hall cupboard switch. That then connects to the office switch. There's other devices connected off both those switches. It's really, really nice. Going to UniFi devices. This shows all devices. We saw this before. There's some updates there. I'll need to update them. And we can see the experience here for this switch is 2 gigabit, and that's because this switch is connected over link aggregation. I mean, it's not quite 2 gigabit because it's load balancing across them essentially, but yeah, I can get the sort of terminology they're doing here. So now we can come in here and see all the devices, and this basically lists all the devices on the network. And it's pretty good, although it does seem to be a bit weird at detecting devices. For example, these two Red Hat devices here aren't Red Hat Linux machines at all, they're Android phones, so I don't know why they're showing up as Red Hat. And it's just a couple of weird things like that. I think it also detects this device here as it's showing like a symbol of a MacBook, but that's a printer. But it's detecting it as like a MacBook because the printer is AirPrint compatible, so it listens on a similar device to a port to a Mac. It's just a little bit quirky like that. Although it does detect it as a printer in here, it's just got a weird, yeah, it's got a sort of laptop, a MacBook as a pictures. There's a few little quirks with it, but it does generally work pretty well. Now, it is worth mentioning though, that this is a new interface. What Ubiquiti have done is they've launched this new style UniFi controller, but it's not actually finished yet. It's very much in beta, but it's the default UI you get when you log in. And if you come down into advanced settings here, you can see it says up here, not seeing everything, go to classic settings. Now, if we press that, that will actually take us down here and it'll let me pick to disable the new user interface. And this is the thing, there's some features in this new user interface that don't actually work. A good example that I found that was driving me mad before I realised is if we come down here into UniFi devices, pick one of these switches, and obviously we've got all the switch ports. Now, if I want to set these different ports on different VLANs, so I've got a group of ports and I want to configure them all to have the same port profile. You can't do that. If I come down to device here, with this new user interface, I can only pick one of these ports at a time. And I have to go into one of them, and then in here I can pick the port profile. And I was going through thinking, is this how you have to do it? And trying to pick individual ports. And I had a 24 port switch and I was trying to set them all to the same port profile, and it was taking ages. And I remember before that I didn't have to do that. But sure enough, if you switch to the old experience, it's fine. So now here we are back in the old experience, and likewise we come back into the same switch, the hall cupboard switch, and we've got all the ports. But if we come here, I can now pick multiple ports at once like that, come down here, hit edit selected, and then I can change the port profile en masse. And that makes a lot more sense. So it's good to know that that is still all there, and at least it seems that Ubiquiti are aware that the new experience does lack some of those features, so hopefully they won't remove this old experience before they've moved literally all of these features, including things like this, over. But it is weird that they kind of throw you by default into a beta interface, because that would confuse a lot of people. And even for me, as someone who's configured a lot of Ubiquiti stuff before using this older interface, even through me, and I was thinking, wait, I swear there was a way to do this in bulk before, but I couldn't find it. And I got halfway through the switch changing all the port profiles before I thought, actually, I'm going to go and change it to the old experience. And sure enough, after doing that, it worked fine. So I'm kind of trying to, by default, use the new experience because it is a lot nicer and I just want to, try it out at least. But I do find myself quite often having to flip back into the old experience just to do little things like this. So hopefully they'll update that soon though. But just while we're in the classic interface, you can also see that slightly dodgy device fingerprinting I've mentioned before, but almost a bit more noticeable here. Whereas if I go into my laptop here, if I click on my MacBook Pro, so like that one there, for example, you can see if we go down to device fingerprint, it's fine, it just detects it as like Apple MacBook, that's fine. But if I come up here and pick the same laptop on the Wi-Fi, because the laptop is currently connected to both Ethernet and Wi-Fi, if I pick the Wi-Fi entry for the laptop, and we look here, you can see that it's detecting it as an Apple MacBook Pro 16-inch 2019. It's not, it's a 15-inch 2016. So it feels like they're trying to be too smart with this device fingerprinting and then failing, because they're obviously trying to go fine enough grain to go down to the level of the exact screen size and model of laptop, but they've not got precise enough fingerprinting for that, so they're detecting it wrong. So, I mean, it's not a problem. I've never actually used sort of device fingerprinting like this in practice, but maybe if you were trying to use it in practice and you're trying to like find a specific device, this could throw you off because you could potentially be looking for a 16-inch 2019 MacBook Pro and totally ignoring the one that actually is because it's a different model. So there's a few little quirks like that. But it's not the biggest deal in the world. Likewise, actually, when I mentioned the printer had the wrong icon, on the classic interface you can actually see it even more, because in the new interface I think it did detect as Hewlett-Packard, but if I click the printer now, the device fingerprint is saying it's an Apple MacBook Air 2017, made by Apple. It's definitely an HP LaserJet. So there's just a few little quirks with this, and I think they're just trying to be a bit too smart with it and then failing. But it's not the biggest deal, and hopefully they'll fix that in a future software update. So now, as I mentioned earlier, there's just a few little features of this that make it a bit more limited than some other devices like the Edge routers or PFSense or Vios or all those other routers. One of the ones I've found is around WAN configuration. Here we have my WAN connection. I've gone into it. It's a PPPoE connection. I've removed the credentials just so I don't have to blur them, but there's normally a username and password in there. And it just gets an IP address automatically. Now, one thing a lot of people complained about with these is that you used to not be able to have multiple WAN IPs. You now actually can. They finally changed it. It took them way too long, but you can now put additional IP addresses in here. You can do it if you're using PPPoE, static, dynamic, whatever. You can add additional static IP addresses in there, and then you can use those as a source as a destination address in your NAT rules. So you can actually have multiple WAN IPs and then port forward traffic from different IP addresses or going to different IPs. It actually works pretty well. But there isn't a way in here to directly configure the interface. Now, this is an issue for me because I'm using a PPPoE connection. So because of that, you've got an overhead of the PPPoE packets. That means that when you've got a 1500 byte MTU on your interface, some of that packet size has to be taken up by the PPPoE header. And that means that the actual leftover capacity for your actual traffic, it means you've got 1492 bytes per packet. Now that's usually fine, it's never really a problem. But you do occasionally find if you've got an external server that's badly configured, you could sometimes have connection issues. Now it's really rare. However, my ISP and modem and all that sort of stuff supports what's called baby jumbo frames, and there's an RFC for it, I can't remember the number. But what you can do is if you set the WAN interface to an MTU of 1508 bytes, you can then have your PPPoE header, you can make all the packets coming out slightly larger, and that will then let you have enough headroom to fit a full 1500 byte Ethernet frame into your PPPoE packets. And that's worked on every other router I've used. I've used it on Vios, PFSense, it's always worked. And even on my old USG, I could go into the advanced settings where you used to be able to create a config file on the controller that would set custom Edge OS settings on the USG. And I was able to do that and set up the interface and set the MTUs correctly so I could get a full 1500 byte MTU on my WAN connection. However, with this, because it doesn't run Edge OS, you can no longer do that custom underlying Edge OS config. We'll take a look at the actual software a bit under the hood in the next video, but this runs UniFi OS, so it's not Edge OS, it's really just Linux using things like DNS mask to provide some services. So you don't have that interface for configuring things like the MTU underneath. You could probably bodge it with a bunch of shell scripts configuring the interfaces if you SSH in, but I don't want to do that. And unfortunately, as you can see in here, there's no way to set things like the MTU on the WAN interface. So this is a bit of an issue. It's fine, it totally works, and it does support MSS clamping, so you can use that if you have to, if you're using PPPoE. But it would be really nice if I could use that feature from my ISP, which unfortunately I can't use with this. But at least it now does support multiple WAN IPs, because that's something people used to complain a lot about, and people still complain a lot about, not realising it now supports it. But yeah, that's a little issue that I found. The other issue I found is in the DNS resolver. Because this obviously supports a DNS forwarder, it's maybe got a cache, I'm not sure. But that basically means the device on my local network resolve DNS against the US UDM, and then it forwards that on to the external DNS servers. Unfortunately, there's no way to add static entries into that. So for example, my home automation system, I've got Node-RED running on a server, and I want to have Node-RED dot and then my domain on my LAN, and have it so that I can go on a local device on my local network, go to that address and have it resolve its IP address. And what I used to have is I'd have my USG doing that because I could do the custom Edge OS config again. And it then meant if I resolved it on my local network, the USG would resolve that hostname to the local LAN IP address and forward me and let me connect to the device. But again with this, because it's now not running Edge OS where I used to be able to do that underlying custom config, and there's nothing in the web interface to let you set that up, I can't add static entries to that DNS forwarder. Now, what it does seem to do is if your device gets an IP address over DHCP, and in that DHCP negotiation or request or whatever, your device provides the DHCP server on the UDM with its hostname, the UDM will actually correctly resolve that. So if you've got a device that's got a hostname, it will actually automatically start resolving that hostname to its IP address. But that's only if you've got a device getting an IP over DHCP. And I don't want to put my server on DHCP, I want that to have a static IP address. So if the DHCP server goes down, the server still works. So that's a bit annoying. I can't add static DNS entries into the forwarder on this. So I could get around it, but I'll have to use an external DNS server or run a secondary DNS server on my local network and use that. So that's a little bit annoying as well. So yeah, it's a little bit annoying that it doesn't have those features. Neither of them are deal breakers, but it's a little bit annoying. However, yep, I'm very happy with it. It's working absolutely brilliantly. It's been absolutely fantastic. And while people will probably inevitably comment because they haven't watched the video, yes, I know that I could have built a pfSense box, or I could have got a Vios machine, or I could have bought an Edge router, or I could have gone on eBay and bought a used Cisco machine, whatever. I could have done all that. But what I like with this is my home environment. It's not work, it's not a lab. It's just something where I want to be able to just have it work, and I don't want to spend time managing it. And having this being so easy to manage is worth it for me. Yes, it lacks some really advanced routing features, and even some features that I would class as being fairly basic, but it does everything that I really need it to do, and it's so easy to manage that, you know, when I finish work, I don't have to come home and essentially do more work to keep my network running. So yeah, I'm very happy with it. At least for me, the limited features are a small price to pay just for the ease of management and stability of it all. Okay, so that was a look at the software, talking about the setup process, and as I mentioned, I'm pretty happy with it. There's just a few feature limitations. And as you can see, we've now got it installed in the rack and it's all running. Touchscreen's working there as well. You flick through different things there, you can see things like Wi-Fi clients, number of devices connected, things like that. And it also gives things like a graph of like the bandwidth usage. The only thing I found with the graph, with this touchscreen, is that you can't leave it permanently on. If you leave it idle for too long, it does a sort of screensaver. It's like a just sort of like, you know, Starfield kind of thing going on. And I don't quite know why they're enforcing it, because it is an LCD screen, so it's not like it's an OLED that could get burning, but yeah, so if you've got a rack of these, you will have to touch the touchscreen to wake it up. If you want it to show the graphs, you can't just have it showing them permanently. So that's maybe a little disadvantage, but I mean, it's not super important. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with this. However, with this device, you really need to be careful to bear in mind what it's designed for and what it isn't. A lot of the marketing and a lot of the other reviews make this out to be some sort of massively amazing router, the best router, the ultimate router, whatever, sort of stuff like that. It is a really good device, but for very certain use cases. So where I would see this device being suitable is for either high-end home environments. I'm thinking either devices like here, systems like here, for example, or if you're, say, building a really high-end smart home, you know, the homes where people will get a company in to install a bunch of really high-end home automation systems and AV installations. Those sorts of homes that might have a rack of AV equipment, this would be a very good device for that. I could also see it being very useful in, say, small hospitality environments. If you've got, say, a bar or a restaurant or a club that just needs to really provide public Wi-Fi and then have a sort of separate isolated network for things like point of sale devices, a back office network, and maybe some sort of network for CCTV, either using the built-in NVR or a separate CCTV that you just need just an isolated local network for. Those sorts of environments, this would also be ideal for. Now, when you start talking about offices, this is where you now need to start being a bit more careful, because it feels like the sort of device that you could very quickly outgrow. If we're talking about a very small office, you know, just a single site, maybe a small travel agent with 5 to 10 people who all just work on individual computers, they either use something like Office 365 to host all their business resources in the cloud, or they might have like a single server in the office, like a NAS that they connect to that might also be a domain controller or something. In that really small environment, this could probably be okay. You know, they're probably going to have a single, very simple internet connection, DSL or cable or something like that, with a single IP address. They can use the remote access VPN on this to VPN in if they need to do that to access resources in the office. And for that sort of environment, that would be fine. You know, you could have one LAN, maybe have guest Wi-Fi, maybe have a separate network for your cameras, that sort of stuff. Something very simple like that, this could work for. But when you're getting larger or more complex than that, you might start finding limitations of this. For example, if you're, say, an office that's going to want to terminate multiple VPNs onto this, it does support site-to-site VPNs, but you could find you have limitations. For example, if you want to connect this out to a data center and then have multiple offices linked together as well, and then have fancy routing to route between those different sites, and then maybe different firewall rules and stuff, you might be able to do it, but you might suddenly start finding that you're just a little limitation that you can't quite do in the UI, and then it could totally scupper you. Additionally, this doesn't support any sort of dynamic routing, so if you want to do any of that, you know, it's totally out of the question. And then even with just things like it doesn't support any sort of high availability. So if you're in a sort of larger office where you've got, you know, it's critical that your services stay up, you couldn't have a pair of these running redundantly, so that if one went down, the other one would stay up. You can only have a single UDM, so it'll act as a single point of failure in your network. So with those sorts of larger environments where you could outgrow something like this, you do need to be careful. With some of those things, like, say, fancy dynamic routing stuff on your WAN connection, you could potentially get around that by having an external router, some sort of any other router really, PSNs, Vios, EdgeOS, Cisco, whatever. You could have that on the WAN side, have your WAN connection or your multiple WAN connections going into that, do your fancy routing on that, and then just have that then connected into the UDM, and just have the UDM doing things like LAN services, DHCP, DNS forwarding, firewalling, that sort of stuff. And it would give you that nice UniFi management interface for it anyway. So having an external router on the WAN side could benefit you a little bit and get you a little bit more headroom, but it does feel like the sort of thing you could outgrow quite quickly. With UniFi, I feel their different categories of products cater for different sizes of businesses. Some of them can scale further than others. For example, their access points, I feel, are quite mature, and you can generally use them in quite large environments. Their switching is definitely getting up there as well. For a while it was a bit limited, and it still isn't as good as some other options. But they're now bringing out layer 3 switches that have at least some sort of layer 3 capability, and they're bringing out those big aggregation switches now, and they've now got a lot of 10 gig options. They're bringing out some 25 gig and even some 100 gig options. So they're starting to bring out these bigger devices. So their switching could now start to get a little bit bigger and fit into larger networks. However, their routing is generally still at the very bottom level. It's generally fine for small businesses or home use. If you've got an office with 100 people in it, you wouldn't be using UniFi's routing. However, that's totally fine. It's very common to have UniFi environments where you're using them only for the switching and the access points, and you're using a separate router. That's totally fine, it's totally supported. So with these devices, you just need to be very careful. The UDM-Pro is an excellent device, but only if you've got the right environment for it. If you're a home user, it could be pretty good. If you're some sort of very small business, hospitality, or a really small office or something like that, it could be fine. However, if you're an advanced office or an advanced business that's going to have a lot of complex needs, you might find this to be too limited. Likewise, for home lab use, this is probably not the device to go for. I see a lot of people complaining, oh, I bought this for home and it's so limited, it doesn't support, and then they'll provide the name of a very advanced feature that the average home would not use. Oh, it doesn't support dynamic routing, I need this for home. And it's like, well, the average home doesn't do dynamic routing. If you've got a home lab, you wouldn't want to use a UDM like this. Now, what I would personally do is I would have the UDM as my router for my home doing my general stuff, and I'd have a separate router just doing the lab, so it's kind of separated. But if you're wanting to only have one router for your home lab, yeah, don't use UniFi for that. It'll be far too limited. So yeah, as I keep saying, I've lost track of how many times I've probably said it now, it is a good device. You just need to be using it in the right environment and make sure that it has all the features that you need, because you might find that it's lacking some features that complex environments might require. So there you go. That was a look at moving my home network away from a USG Pro and onto a UDM Pro. Now, this video has been an absolute epic. It's probably the longest video I've ever done. I think it will be. But if you stayed to the end, then thank you very much for watching. If you're interested in buying this, there's links in the description. And also stand by for a video I'll be doing in a couple of videos' time, where I do a teardown of this. So we'll take it apart, we'll look at the hardware inside it, and then I'll SSH in and dig into the software at a much lower level, just to see how the software on this actually works, and see if we can get a bit more information about what hardware is inside it. So yeah, definitely stay tuned and subscribe for that. But yeah, thank you very much for watching.